The door to the Haskins ranch swung open before Wilhelmina Alden could even raise her fist to knock, and the man standing in the frame looked at her with eyes so steady, so certain, that her heart seized in her chest like a bird caught in a trap. He had expected her. That was the first thing she understood, and it shattered something inside her that she had only just managed to piece back together over 5 days of brutal stagecoach travel across the sun-hammered plains of Colorado Territory. She had rehearsed this arrival 100 times in her head. She would knock, she would introduce herself with careful dignity, she would explain the misunderstanding in measured words, and she would leave before nightfall with her honor intact. That had been the plan. But the plan had not accounted for Elijah Haskins standing in his doorway at 7:30 in the evening, still fully dressed in a clean dark shirt and pressed trousers, a lantern burning behind him as though he had lit it specifically for her arrival, looking at her, the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for and is not surprised to finally see. "You are not Clara," he said, and his voice was low and deliberate, and the words hit her like a verdict. Wilhelmina lifted her chin. "No," she said, "I am not." Behind her, the stagecoach rattled away down the dirt road, taking with it the last easy escape she would have for the next 2 weeks and possibly for the rest of her life, though she did not know that yet. She only knew that the man in the doorway had not moved, had not looked confused, had not looked wounded or betrayed the way a man should look when a stranger appeared in place of the woman. He had paid the Beaumont matrimonial agency of St. Louis $45 to send him as a prospective bride. He simply looked at her the way the Colorado sky looked at the mountains, as if they had always belonged in the same line of sight. And Wilhelmina Alden, who had spent the better part of 28 years making very careful, very logical decisions, felt the ground shift under her boots. She had not meant to be here at all. That was the devastating truth she had been carrying the entire journey. She had not meant to come to the Haskins Ranch in Cutter's Creek, Colorado Territory, in the dry August heat of 1878. She had not meant to sit in the back of a swaying Concord coach with a borrowed carpetbag and a letter she had no right to be carrying. She had not meant to step off that coach and follow the hand-drawn map that her younger sister Clara had shoved into her hands 3 days before she was supposed to leave St. Louis forever. But Clara had not come, and someone had needed to tell Elijah Haskins why. How Wilhelmina ended up being that someone was a story that had begun not with drama but with a very ordinary Tuesday morning and a letter she should never have opened. Clara Alden was the beautiful one. That was not cruelty or bitterness. It was simply a fact that both sisters had lived with for years, the way people live with weather. Clara had the soft golden hair and the enormous blue eyes, and the laugh that made rooms tilt toward her like flowers toward sun. Wilhelmina had the dark eyes and the strong jaw and the laugh that came out too loud when she genuinely found something funny, which she frequently did, to the ongoing embarrassment of their mother. Clara had been engaged twice before she was 23. Wilhelmina had been engaged 0 times before she was 28, primarily because she was too busy keeping the Alden household running after their father died and left behind more debts than dignity. It had been Wilhelmina who negotiated with the creditors. It had been Wilhelmina who found the boarders, who managed the rooms, who kept the accounts. It had been Wilhelmina who noticed, on a Tuesday morning in June of 1878, that the letter from the Beaumont matrimonial agency had arrived for Clara, and that Clara was not home, and that the return address indicated time-sensitive correspondence, and that the envelope had already been somewhat loosened by the summer humidity in a way that made opening it feel practically accidental. Clara had signed with the agency 2 months ago, without telling anyone. The letter explained the match. One Elijah Haskins, age 32, owner of the Haskins Ranch in Cutter's Creek, Colorado Territory, in possession of 1,200 acres of good grazing land, 300 head of cattle, a house described as solid and comfortable, and a character described by 2 references as steady and honorable. He was seeking a wife of good sense, kind character, and willingness to embrace frontier life. He was not seeking beauty specifically, which Wilhelmina had found both admirable and interesting. The agency had arranged for Clara to travel to Cutter's Creek in late August, where she would spend 2 weeks as a guest at the ranch before any formal agreement was made. Either party could decline at the end of the 2 weeks with no obligation. Wilhelmina had read the letter 3 times. Then she had folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and gone about her day. Then Clara eloped with a traveling piano salesman named Horace Pemberton on the 4th of July, leaving behind nothing but a hastily scrawled note and the letter from the Beaumont matrimonial agency, which she had apparently forgotten or simply stopped caring about. Their mother had wept for 6 days. Wilhelmina had stared at the letter and thought about Elijah Haskins, who had paid $45 in good faith and was expecting a woman who no longer existed in any practical sense, and she had felt something she could only describe as a profound, complicated ache. She had not meant to write to him, and yet she had. She had not meant to tell him the truth about what happened, and yet the truth had come out, because Wilhelmina had never in her life been capable of the small, merciful lies that kept social machinery running smoothly. She had written to Elijah Haskins and told him that his prospective bride had married someone else, that the agency was not at fault, and that he deserved to know before he made any preparations or incurred any further expense on her behalf. She had signed it Wilhelmina Alden, sister, and she had posted it and considered the matter closed. He had written back within 8 days, which was frankly astonishing given the distance. His handwriting was not elegant, but it was clear and deliberate, each letter formed with the kind of care that suggested a man who did not waste words. He thanked her for her honesty. He said he appreciated the directness. He said he would contact the agency about the situation. And then, in the final paragraph, he said something that had kept Wilhelmina awake for 3 nights running. He said, "I confess that reading your letter, I found myself wishing it had been you who came, rather than being the bearer of someone else's absence. You have the quality of a person who says exactly what they mean, which I have found to be rarer than good grazing land out here, and I value it considerably more." Wilhelmina had read that paragraph until the paper went soft at the folds. She had not written back. It would have been inappropriate. It would have been the kind of bold, reckless thing her mother had been warning her against her entire life. He was a stranger. He had been corresponding with the agency about her sister. There were proprieties to be observed, and there were lines that a sensible woman did not step across. But then the agency wrote to her family to inform them that, due to the unusual circumstances, and the fact that their client had expressed a particular interest in hearing from Wilhelmina Alden directly, the agency was willing to consider an alternative arrangement if Miss Alden was willing to present herself as a potential match for Mr. Haskins at no cost to either party, given the inconvenience the Alden family had caused. Their mother had folded that letter into her apron pocket and said nothing for 2 full days. On the 3rd day, she had come to Wilhelmina's room, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and said very quietly, "You have given up enough for this family, Mina. If there is something that might be good for you, you should be allowed to find out." Wilhelmina had left for Cutter's Creek on the 22nd of August, 1878, with a borrowed carpetbag and a letter from the agency and 300 miles of uncertainty ahead of her, and she had arrived at the door of the Haskins ranch at 7:30 in the evening of the 27th of August, a full day ahead of schedule because the stagecoach had made better time than expected through the mountain pass, and found Elijah Haskins standing in the doorway of his own house as though he had been waiting there since the moment he posted that letter. "You read my letter," she said, because she could not think of anything else that explained the complete absence of surprise on his face. "I read your letter," he confirmed. He stepped back from the door and held it open. "You should come inside. You have been traveling for 5 days and you look like you could use a meal and somewhere to sit that is not moving." Wilhelmina walked past him into the house, and the warmth hit her first, and then the smell of coffee and something baking, and then the realization that the table in the kitchen had been set for two. She stopped walking. "You set the table," she said. "The agency sent a telegram 2 days ago saying you were ahead of schedule," he said, moving past her to the stove with the unhurried efficiency of a man very comfortable in his own space. "Coffee." "Yes," she said, because yes was the only possible answer to coffee after 5 days on a stagecoach. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at the room around her while he poured. The house was not what she had expected, though she realized she had not formed a specific expectation, which was unusual for her. The walls were solid pine, well fitted, and someone had put shelves up along two of them, and the shelves held books. Not decorative books, not the kind of books people keep to signal culture. These were red books, spines worn, pages soft from handling. She counted 14 titles she recognized before he turned around with the coffee. He handed her a cup, and she wrapped both hands around it and looked at him properly for the first time since the door, because she had been carefully not doing so up until this moment. He was tall, which she had somehow known he would be, though the agency description had not specified. He had a face that was not classically handsome, but was deeply, genuinely interesting, the kind of face built from years of weather and work and thought, with dark eyes set under heavy brows and a jaw that looked like it had made a lot of hard decisions. He was 32, which she knew from the letter, and he looked it, not old, not weathered beyond his years, just fully arrived in himself in a way that many men twice his age never managed. He was looking at her the same way she was looking at him. "You read more books than I expected," she said, because that was the safest thing she could find to say. "You are more direct than I expected," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was clearly a cousin of one. "Though after your letter, perhaps I should have expected exactly that." Wilhelmina sat down at the table, because her legs had been standing for most of 5 days and they deserved a rest, and also because sitting down gave her something concrete to do. He brought the food, which was a genuine surprise because she had assumed there would be a housekeeper or a cook, and instead there was clearly just Elijah Haskins, who had made biscuits and a beef stew with root vegetables and had set the table and lit a lamp and was waiting for a woman who was not the woman the agency had originally promised him. "Mr. Haskins," she said carefully. "Elijah," he said. She looked at him. The directness was mutual, apparently. "Elijah," she said. "I want to be honest with you about the situation." "I would expect nothing less," he said, sitting down across from her and picking up his fork with the calm of a man who did not dread difficult conversations. "I am not my sister," she said. "I am aware that the agency has framed this as an alternative arrangement, but I want to be very clear that I am not here to simply fill a vacancy. I came because," she stopped, because the honest completion of that sentence was something she had been avoiding for 300 miles. "Because," he said, and his voice was patient in a way that was almost unbearable, because patience was not a thing Wilhelmina had been on the receiving end of very often. "Because you said I seemed like the kind of person who says what they mean," she said, "and I wanted to find out if you were the same kind of person, and I have not had the luxury of wanting something that clearly frivolous in quite a long time, and I thought perhaps I had earned the right to act on it once." The silence that followed was long enough that she began to regret the speech. And then Elijah Haskins set down his fork, leaned back in his chair, and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and said, "I am exactly that kind of person. And for what it's worth, Miss Alden, I have been eating supper alone at this table for 4 years, and I am very glad you are sitting across from it tonight, whatever the circumstances that brought you here." Wilhelmina took a breath and felt something tightly wound inside her chest begin, very slowly, to loosen. She did not sleep well that first night. This was not unusual. She rarely slept well in unfamiliar places, and the small guest room at the back of the house, while genuinely clean and comfortable, was not her narrow room in St. Louis with the window that rattled in the wind and the specific creak of the third stair that she knew how to avoid. She lay on the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the Colorado Territory at night, the distant swallowed calls of coyotes, the wind in the grass, the occasional low sound of cattle shifting in the dark, and she thought about the expression on Elijah Haskins's face when she had said she came because she wanted to, and she felt something she could only describe as terrified hope. Terrified was the relevant word, because hope was a thing she had mostly stopped indulging since her father died. Hope had a dark past in the Alden household. It had led her father to bad investments and her mother to dependency and her sister to a piano salesman, and Wilhelmina had watched all three of those stories unfold and had drawn the obvious conclusion, which was that hope was a trap dressed in pretty clothes, and the sensible thing to do was keep your head down and your accounts balanced and not want things that might be taken away. But here she was, 300 miles from everything she had ever managed, in a house full of read books, and the man on the other side of the wall had said he was glad she was sitting there. She was still awake when the sky outside the window began to lighten from black to dark blue to the particular luminous gray that preceded the Colorado sunrise, and then she heard movement in the house and smelled coffee, and she got up and dressed and went to the kitchen because she was not the kind of woman who stayed in bed while someone else made breakfast. Elijah was at the stove, and he turned when she came in and did not look surprised to see her up at this hour. "Early riser," he said. "Habitual insomniac," she said, "but the result is the same." He handed her a cup of coffee that was already exactly how she had taken it the night before, which was black with half a spoonful of sugar, and she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the Haskins ranch coming into the morning light. The land was extraordinary. She had known intellectually that it would be significant land because 1,200 acres was a significant number, but knowing a number and standing at a kitchen window and watching 1,000 acres of Colorado grassland materialize out of the morning dark were entirely different experiences. The mountains to the west were still purple in the early light, and the grass moved in long, slow waves in the pre-dawn wind, and the cattle were dark shapes scattered across the near pasture, and the whole thing had the quality of something both ancient and immediate, like watching the world make up its mind about the day. "It is beautiful," she said, and meant it without reservation. "Yes," he said from beside her, and she became aware that he was not looking at the land. She made herself look at her coffee cup. "You should not do that," she said. "Do what?" "Look at me that way when we have been acquainted for approximately 12 hours, she said. "How am I looking at you?" He asked, and his voice had that quality of genuine question rather than deflection. She considered lying and decided against it on principle. "Like you have already made up your mind about something," she said. "I have had 4 years of eating supper alone and approximately 3 months of corresponding with the Beaumont Matrimonial Agency," he said. "And in that time I received exactly 1 letter that I read more than twice, and it was not from the agency. So yes, I have perhaps been forming opinions longer than 12 hours. Wilhelmina turned that over in her mind and felt the terrified hope tighten its grip. "The arrangement," she said carefully, "is 2 weeks. We are supposed to spend 2 weeks in one another's company before either party is obligated to anything." "That is the arrangement," he agreed. "Then I suggest we begin," she said, "and I suggest we be honest with each other throughout, and I suggest we try to pretend that neither of us has already formed any opinions, so that the opinions we form during the 2 weeks are the ones that count." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is the most sensible proposal I have received in quite some time," he said. "I specialize in sensible proposals," she said, and this time she let herself smile, just a little, and watched his face change in response, and thought that this was going to be the most complicated 2 weeks of her life. Over the following days, Wilhelmina Alden discovered that the real danger of Elijah Haskins was not his looks, though those were certainly worth considering, and it was not his land or his solid house or the practical evidence of his competence in everything he touched. The real danger was his mind. The man read everything he could get his hands on. He had a subscription to 3 different newspapers that arrived by post. He ordered books from a seller in Denver, and he had opinions about all of them that were informed and thoughtful and frequently surprising. On the second morning, they argued about the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia for 45 minutes over breakfast, and Wilhelmina won the argument, and he laughed, genuinely and fully, not the polite half-laugh of a man managing a woman's contribution to the conversation, but the real laugh of someone who had been genuinely outmaneuvered and found it delightful. She had not expected to find delight in the same place as competence. It seemed like a particularly unfair combination. He showed her the ranch properly on the 3rd day, riding out on horses because 1,200 acres was not a walking distance operation. He rode well, with the particular ease of someone who had grown up doing it, and he had saddled the horses himself, and had clearly considered which horse to give her, and had chosen the calm gray mare named Beatrice rather than any of the more spirited animals, without being asked, and without making a production of the consideration. "Tell me about your father's ranch," Wilhelmina said as they rode out past the far pasture fence, because the agency file had mentioned that Elijah had inherited this land from his father, and she was curious about the shape of that inheritance. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the set of his jaw change slightly, which told her there was a complicated story in the answer. "My father built this ranch from nothing, starting in 1851, he said. "He came out here from Ohio with nothing but a mule and a particular stubbornness about property. He spent 30 years building it into what it is. He died in 1874 and left it to me, his only surviving son, on the condition that I did not sell a single acre of it for the first 10 years of my ownership." "A condition you agreed to?" she asked. "A condition I would have imposed on myself regardless," he said. "This land is worth keeping." "What happened to your brother?" she asked, because surviving implied a brother who had not survived. He looked at her sideways and she saw him decide to answer. "Fever, in 68. He was 21. It was the same fever that took my mother 2 years prior." "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "It gave me a particular understanding of being alone," he said, "which is partly why I contacted the agency." A man can be self-sufficient and still find the silence oppressive after a while. Wilhelmina thought about the silence she had left behind in St. Louis, the silence of a house where everyone was present and no one was quite seen, and found she understood that in a way she had not expected to understand anything about this man's life. "What was your brother's name?" she asked. "Thomas," he said. She nodded, and they rode in comfortable silence for a while, which was itself remarkable, because silence with Elijah Haskins was not the strained quiet of 2 people running out of things to say. It was the easy silence of 2 people who did not need to fill space to feel connected, and Wilhelmina recognized it as something rare and consciously noted it in the part of her mind that kept honest accounts of important things. She was keeping a great many honest accounts of important things that week. She noted that he said please and thank you not as social performance, but as habitual practice, to the ranch hands, to the elderly woman in Cutter's Creek who sold them supplies, to the horses. She noted that he was fair in his dealings with the 2 full-time hands who worked the ranch, a quiet man named Dawes and a younger man named Pettiford who could not have been more than 20, and who clearly regarded Elijah with the particular mixture of respect and affection that indicated a genuinely good employer. She noted that he did not drink to excess, that he did not have a quick temper, that he disagreed with her frequently and directly, and never once condescended. She also noted, with the kind of rigorous honesty she was famous for, that she found herself watching his hands when he worked, and the particular way he moved through the landscape as if he had grown from it the same way the mountains had, and that the terrified hope in her chest was becoming less terrified and more just hope with every passing day. On the 5th evening, they sat on the porch after supper, because the heat of the day had broken, and the evening was extraordinary, the sky doing its Colorado thing of turning 14 different colors on the way to dark. And Elijah told her about the dark past that the agency certainly did not know about. "There is something you should know," he said, which was always a sentence that preceded something significant, and Wilhelmina set down her cup of tea and looked at him and waited. "5 years ago, before my father died, I was engaged to a woman named Margaret Carver. She was the daughter of a rancher in the next county, and we had known each other since we were children, and it seemed like the natural progression of things." He paused. "She left 6 weeks before the wedding. Went to Denver with a man who sold mining equipment, did not leave a letter." Wilhelmina absorbed this. "That must have been very painful," she said. "What was painful," he said carefully, "was not the leaving exactly. It was the realization afterward that I had been planning a future with someone I had never actually told the truth to, because the truth of what I thought and felt had always seemed like too much, or inappropriate, or not what she wanted to hear. And she had left, and I had never known her either, not really, and we had both been pretending at something instead of building it." He looked at her steadily. "I do not want to do that again. I would rather say too much and be wrong than say too little, and find myself standing in a house that is empty in ways I helped create." The honesty of that landed somewhere in Wilhelmina's chest like a stone in still water, sending out rings in all directions. "That is why you valued my letter," she said. "That is why I valued your letter," he confirmed. "You did not know me from Adam, and you could have said nothing at all, or sent a very polite note through the agency. And instead you sat down and wrote me the actual truth in plain language. And I thought, whoever that woman is, she does not deal in comfortable fictions, and I have had enough of those to last a lifetime." Wilhelmina looked out at the darkening sky and thought about comfortable fictions and the work she had done her whole life maintaining them for other people's benefit, and felt something very old and very tired in her finally exhale. "I was not always like this," she said quietly. "I used to try to soften things when I was younger. I thought it was what people wanted. But it never seemed to help anyone, and I was worse at it than my sister, who was much better at saying the gentle, untrue thing, and eventually I concluded that I was simply constitutionally unsuited to it and stopped trying." "And were people troubled by that?" he asked. "Frequently," she said and smiled. "My mother has been trying to file that particular edge off me for 28 years. You would think she would have given up by now." He laughed, and the sound of it in the evening air was warm and easy, and Wilhelmina thought about the fact that she had been here 5 days and she had heard that laugh at least once a day, and it was already something she was going to miss fiercely when she left. If she left. The thought arrived with more uncertainty than she had intended to give it. The 7th day brought trouble, which in the Wild West of 1878 arrived in the form of a man named Rance Bellamy, who rode up to the Haskins fence line in the morning with 2 riders at his back, and a smile that was entirely composed of bad intentions. Wilhelmina was in the kitchen when Elijah went out to meet them, but she could hear the conversation from the window, and she was not the kind of woman who avoided information she might need, so she listened. Bellamy was a land speculator. She understood quickly, and he had been trying to acquire the Haskins ranch land for nearly 2 years, and the presence of a potential Mrs. Haskins on the property appeared to be information he had obtained somewhere, possibly from the telegram the agency had sent, and he had come specifically to make the situation uncomfortable. "Word in town is you brought yourself a woman from the East," Bellamy said, in a voice that dripped false pleasantry. "Might change your thinking about that land offer." "My thinking about the land has not changed," Elijah said, and his voice was the same steady thing it always was. "See, here is what I have been wondering, Haskins," Bellamy said, and Wilhelmina could hear the shift in tone, the edge that had been lurking under the pleasantry revealing itself. "A woman coming out here to a frontier ranch, alone, no family nearby, depending entirely on one man for everything. That is a significant vulnerability, wouldn't you say?" The silence that followed was long enough that Wilhelmina walked out the front door and stood on the porch. Bellamy looked at her with the kind of assessment that made her want to step back inside, but she held her ground and looked at him steadily, which seemed to confuse him slightly, because men like Bellamy were accustomed to women who looked away. "Miss Alden," Elijah said, without turning his head from Bellamy, "this is Rance Bellamy, who is leaving now." "Mr. Bellamy," Wilhelmina said pleasantly. Bellamy looked between them and recalibrated something. "I'll be back," he said. "I know you will be," Elijah said. "I'll be here." After Bellamy and his riders were gone, Elijah turned and walked back to the porch, and there was something in his face that Wilhelmina had not seen before, a controlled anger tightly contained like a fire in a well-built stove. "He is not going to stop," she said. "He never has before," Elijah said. "He bought up the 2 ranches north of me last year. He is trying to build a land holding large enough to bring the railroad through on terms he controls entirely." "Is there anything stopping him legally?" she asked. "My father's deed is iron solid and the 10-year condition is registered with the county clerk," he said. "He cannot force the sale. He can only make living here difficult enough that I might want to leave." "Has it ever worked?" she asked. He looked at her. "Not yet," he said. She thought about hidden motives and power, and the particular kind of man who used proximity to weakness as a weapon. And she thought about the fact that she was a woman alone on a ranch 300 miles from anyone she knew. And she weighed that reality against the steady face of the man standing in front of her, and made a decision. "Tell me everything he has done and everything he might do," she said. "I am good with accounts, and I am good with correspondence, and I am good at finding the legal and practical problems in any argument a person makes. If he comes back to cause trouble, I would like to be useful." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. "You do not have to involve yourself in this," he said. "It is not your problem. I am currently a guest in your house and a potential future inhabitant of this ranch," she said, with a deliberateness that made her own heart rate go up slightly. "And it seems like precisely my problem. Now tell me what I need to know." He told her everything. It came out over the next 2 evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with the ranch ledgers and the property deeds and the relevant correspondence laid out between them. And Wilhelmina went through it all with the focused efficiency she had used on her father's debts, and found 3 things that were important. First, Bellamy had purchased the northern ranches using liens that were not entirely straightforward in their origination. Second, one of those original ranchers, a man named Guthrie, had corresponded with Elijah suggesting the sale had not been entirely voluntary. Third, the railroad company Bellamy was negotiating with was a subsidiary entity of a larger operation that had filed land grant applications that conflicted with Bellamy's proposed terms, which meant Bellamy's entire scheme had a structural problem that he might not even know about yet. "Can you write to the county assessor?" she asked on the second evening of this investigation, looking up from the paper she had been making notes on. "Yes," he said, "and to a lawyer in Denver." "I know one," he said. "Good," she said. "And do you have the original Guthrie correspondence?" He got up and went to the shelf by the window and found a bundle of letters and brought them back. And she took them and read them and found, on the 4th letter, a phrase that old Guthrie had probably written carelessly, but that was, under Colorado territory law, a documented record of coercion. She looked up and found Elijah watching her with an expression that she could not categorize, something too layered for a single word, and she felt suddenly self-conscious in a way she had not been since the first night. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and then more honestly, everything. The tension of that single word sat between them in the lamplight, and Wilhelmina thought about the dark past he had told her about, and the comfortable fictions, and the woman named Margaret who had left without a letter. And she thought about Clara and the piano salesman, and the fact that she had spent her entire adult life managing things for other people, and never once paused to consider what she was actually building for herself. "Elijah," she said. "Yes," he said, and the way he said it made her think he knew what was coming. "I have been very careful," she said, "to remind myself that this is an arrangement with a fixed timeline and that I should not be forming conclusions about things I cannot know yet." "I know," he said. "I am not certain I am succeeding at that," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have been succeeding even less." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the lamplight was steady between them, and somewhere outside, the coyotes were distant and irrelevant, and the world outside the kitchen window was very large and very patient. And Wilhelmina Alden, who had been sensible her entire life, reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand turned under hers and held it. They stayed that way for a long moment that was worth more than anything Wilhelmina had managed to account for in years of careful management, and then she said, "We still have a week to go." "We do," he said. "Then we should sleep and write to the Denver lawyer tomorrow," she said, with a steadiness she found genuinely heroic given the circumstances, and he smiled fully and completely and said, "Yes, we should." She did not sleep any better that night, but for entirely different reasons than uncertainty. The letter to the Denver lawyer went out with Pettiford on the following morning, and Wilhelmina wrote most of it, in her clear, direct hand, laying out the property history and the Guthrie documentation, and the railroad grant conflict in 4 pages of precise legal argument that she had no formal training to write, but had been practicing her whole life in the form of creditor negotiations and boarding-house contracts. Elijah read it before Pettiford left and said it was the best letter he had ever seen written for any purpose. She told him he was being generous. He said, "I am not a generous man. Ask anyone." She asked Dawes the next day because she was thorough, and Dawes looked at her with the quiet assessment of a man who had worked for Elijah Haskins for 6 years and said, "No, he ain't generous with the flattery. Particular about it, more like. If he said it was good, it was good." Wilhelmina filed that information carefully. The 11th day brought a complication she had not anticipated, which arrived in the form of a woman named Lucinda Crane, who drove into the ranch yard in a very nice buggy and looked at Wilhelmina with the expression of someone who had expected to find a less capable opponent. Lucinda Crane was, as far as Wilhelmina could establish in the first 2 minutes of conversation, the widowed wife of a former business partner of Elijah's father, a woman of approximately 35 with good looks and better connections, who had apparently made it known around Cutter's Creek for the better part of 2 years that she intended to marry Elijah Haskins, and who had taken the news of the matrimonial agency arrangement as both a personal insult and a tactical problem. She came, Wilhelmina suspected, to assess the opposition. "Miss Alden," she said, in a tone that managed to be both cordial and dismissive, "how brave of you to come all this way." "It was a straightforward journey by stagecoach," Wilhelmina said, "not especially brave." Lucinda looked at the house and then back at Wilhelmina with the look of a woman recalculating. "You seem very settled already," she said. "I have been here 11 days, Wilhelmina said. "I find settling into useful work comes naturally." "I see you have made yourself indispensable," Lucinda said, and the word was not a compliment. "I have tried to be helpful," Wilhelmina said. "It is a habit." The conversation was conducted entirely in the ranch yard because Wilhelmina had not invited her inside, which was its own kind of message, and eventually Lucinda drove away, and Wilhelmina went back into the kitchen and found Elijah in the doorway watching her with something very close to amusement. "You did not invite her in," he said. "She did not come to visit," Wilhelmina said. "She came to examine the situation. I saw no reason to extend comfort to someone conducting reconnaissance." Elijah shook his head slowly. "You are remarkable," he said, and it came out with a quality that was not complimentary in the social sense but personal and genuine and direct in a way that was very much his particular register, and Wilhelmina felt it land somewhere central and important. "She was hoping I would be intimidated," Wilhelmina said. "Were you?" he asked. She considered the honest answer. "Slightly," she said. "She is very beautiful, and she clearly knows you, and she has the advantage of being here when you are not looking for anyone. But being slightly intimidated is not the same as being stopped. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stood in front of her and said, "Lucinda Crane is a good woman by most measures. She has also made it clear for 2 years that what she wants is this land and a man to go with it, not the other way around. I am perceptive enough to know the difference." "Elijah," she said. "I know we have 2 more days," he said. "I am aware of the timeline." "I was not going to bring up the timeline," she said. He looked slightly surprised by that. "No. I was going to say that I have been writing letters home and my mother has been reading between the lines," she said. "And she sent a reply yesterday that was entirely composed of thinly veiled questions about the character of a certain rancher, which tells me she already knows that the timeline may be a formality." The expression that moved across his face in response to that was one of the most honest things she had ever witnessed on a human being, an unguarded, unhidden relief and warmth that he did not attempt to manage or contain. And she thought that this was what it looked like when someone who had been alone for a very long time allowed themselves to believe something good was real. "Mina," he said, which was the first time he had used that diminutive, and the sound of it in his voice hit her with a force that was entirely disproportionate to 2 syllables. "Yes," she said, though it came out slightly less steady than she had intended. "I am going to say something that I have been carefully not saying for 11 days because I was trying to respect the terms of the arrangement," he said. "All right," she said. "I do not want you to leave at the end of the 2 weeks," he said. "I want you to stay. Not because I need a woman on this ranch, or because the agency expects a resolution, but because you are the most genuinely interesting person I have been in a room with in a very long time, and talking to you feels like breathing properly after years of short breath. And I have watched you at my kitchen table, and at my fence posts, and on the back of my horse, and in conversation with every person you have met. And in every single instance you are exactly who you say you are, and I find that extraordinary. And I am deeply and inconveniently in love with you." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a meadowlark was making its particular ascending call in the grass. Wilhelmina said, "That was considerably more than I expected." "I warned you I was going to say too much," he said. "You did," she agreed. She took a breath. "Elijah, I came here because a letter from a stranger was the first thing I had read in years that made me feel like the way I am built might be an asset rather than a liability. And I have spent 11 days discovering that you are precisely who you presented yourself to be in that letter, which is the first time in my adult life I can say that about another human being outside of my own immediate experience. And I have been telling myself for 11 days that I was proceeding carefully and maintaining appropriate perspective. And I have been lying to myself, because I decided somewhere around day 3 that I would like nothing more than to stay here and argue with you over breakfast for the rest of my natural life." He laughed that full real laugh, and then he reached up and touched her face very gently, with the careful, deliberate intention that characterized everything he did, and said, "Will you marry me, Wilhelmina Alden?" She covered his hand with hers and said, "Yes." They did not plan a large wedding, because neither of them was inclined toward large productions, and also because there was a great deal of work to do. The letter from the Denver lawyer arrived on the 14th day, which happened to also be the last day of the formal arrangement period, and it confirmed everything Wilhelmina had suspected about Bellamy's problematic land dealings and the railroad grant conflict, and it included a letter of introduction to the county land office and a recommendation that a formal complaint be filed against Bellamy for the coercive circumstances of the Guthrie purchase. Elijah read the lawyer's letter and then looked across the table at Wilhelmina, who had already begun drafting the formal complaint on a separate sheet of paper without being asked. "You started already," he said. "Time sensitive," she said, not looking up. He watched her for a moment and then said, "I think I should tell the agency that the arrangement has resolved satisfactorily." "Tell them it has resolved permanently," she said. They were married at the Cutters Creek Church on a Saturday in late September, 1878, on a morning that was the particular golden color that Colorado autumn managed, when the aspens had gone yellow, and the sky was a deep, unambiguous blue, and the air had the sharpness of a season beginning. Reverend Holloway presided. A small man with large sincerity, and Dawes and Pettiford stood up for Elijah, and the storekeeper's wife, a woman named Mrs. Connolly, who had taken an immediate and vigorous liking to Wilhelmina the first time they met, stood with her. Wilhelmina's mother could not come in time, the distance being what it was, but she sent a letter that arrived 3 days before the wedding, and that Wilhelmina read standing in the kitchen in the morning light, and then folded very carefully and put in her pocket and carried all day. The letter said, among other things, "I have been watching you manage this family's needs for 10 years with your father's stubbornness and your grandmother's practicality, and I have prayed for years that someone would recognize what I see when I look at you. I believe they have. Be happy, Mina. You have been good long enough to have earned a great deal of it." Elijah found her in the kitchen with that letter in her hands, and a specific quality of expression on her face that he recognized by then as the emotion she did not quite know how to show. And he did not ask what was in the letter, because he understood by then when she needed the space to feel things without explanation. He simply poured her a cup of coffee and sat with her, and she was glad of his company in a way that was by then as familiar and essential as the coffee itself. The wedding was simple and direct, which suited both of them entirely. She wore a dress she had altered herself from a bolt of deep blue calico that Mrs. Connolly had helped her source, and she carried a small bunch of the late autumn wildflowers that still persisted in the pasture grass. And Elijah wore the dark jacket he had been wearing the first evening she arrived, which she had come to think of as the jacket he wore when something mattered. And he looked at her when she walked toward him with the same expression she had first seen in his doorway 11 days before the wedding and 15 days after their first correspondence. The expression of a man who had been expecting something and had not been wrong about what to expect. The words of the ceremony were the traditional ones, and Wilhelmina said hers in a clear voice, because she was always clear when she meant something, and Elijah said his in that low, deliberate voice, looking at her steadily throughout, and when Reverend Holloway pronounced them married, Elijah took her face in both his careful hands and kissed her with the same quality that characterized everything about him: intention, warmth, and an absolute lack of performance. The small gathering of Cutter's Creek residents who had come to witness applauded, and Mrs. Connolly wept in the satisfying way of a woman who had been hoping for exactly this outcome. Bellamy did not attend the wedding. He sent through a messenger a note to Elijah that congratulated him on his marriage and suggested that a new wife might shift his thinking about putting down roots in a difficult landscape. The note was not threatening precisely, but its implications were unmistakable. Wilhelmina read the note at the wedding supper and said, "He is frightened." "Why do you say that?" Pettiford asked, with the eager attention of a young man learning how the world worked. "Because he sent a note at all," she said. "A man who is confident sends nothing. A man who is worried sends a message dressed as congratulations. He has heard something about the Denver lawyer, and he is trying to find out how much we know." Elijah caught her eye across the table, and she saw the particular warmth there that she was learning to receive without deflecting, and she let herself receive it, because this was her wedding evening, and she had earned the right to a single evening of receiving things. They built the autumn together with the particular efficiency of two people who were both accustomed to work, and had now found that work done alongside someone else was fundamentally different from work done alone. Elijah managed the cattle operation and the ranch hands and the physical infrastructure of 1,200 acres with the long-practiced competence of a man who had been doing it for years. And Wilhelmina took over the accounts, and the correspondence and the business relationships and the strategic planning, and the two operations fit together with a satisfying precision that neither of them had designed intentionally, but both of them recognized as right. The Bellamy situation resolved itself, as Wilhelmina had suspected it would, through legal and administrative channels rather than any dramatic confrontation. The Denver lawyer filed the formal complaint in October, and the county land office investigation took 6 weeks, and the railroad company's conflicting grant application became a matter of public record in December. And by January of 1879, Rance Bellamy's carefully constructed scheme had unraveled sufficiently that he sold his recently acquired properties and relocated to New Mexico Territory, which by all accounts he found somewhat more hospitable to his particular methods. He stopped by the Haskins ranch on his way out of Colorado, which Wilhelmina found either bold or stupid, and told Elijah, in a tone that was trying very hard to be gracious and not quite managing it, that he had underestimated the Haskins operation. "You underestimated my wife," Elijah said, in a voice that was entirely pleasant and held no triumph. Bellamy looked at Wilhelmina with an expression that was, she thought, as close to genuine respect as a man like Bellamy could get. "Ma'am," he said. "Safe travels, Mr. Bellamy," she said, and meant it, because a man who is gone is not a problem, regardless of the reason for the going. Winter on the Colorado ranch was a different kind of country than summer or autumn, and Wilhelmina spent her first winter learning it the way she learned everything, thoroughly and honestly and with complete attention. The cold was absolute and early, the first snow coming in November and laying its permanent foundation, and the work changed its character to reflect the season. More time spent in the barn and around the stoves, shorter days, longer evenings. She found she liked the evenings best, when the work was done and the house was warm and the fire was good and Elijah was across the kitchen table or in the chair by the fire with a book. And the silence between them was not the silence of two strangers, but the deep quiet of two people who had made their peace with their own company and each other's, and who sat in that peace the way the mountains sat in the snow. Her mother came in the spring. This was a journey of some months' planning and significant logistics, but Louisa Alden was a more resolute woman than her years of dependency had suggested, and she arrived in April on the Cutter's Creek stagecoach with 2 large trunks and a face that had clearly been making comprehensive assessments ever since crossing the Kansas border. Elijah met the stagecoach alongside Wilhelmina because they did everything important together by then, and he helped Louisa Alden down from the coach with the steady, careful manner he had, and Louisa looked at him for a moment, and then looked at Wilhelmina with an expression that said everything about maternal assessment and relief, and was quickly composed into something more dignified. "Mr. Haskins," Louisa said. "Ma'am," he said, and he smiled at her in a way that made Louisa's dignified composure wobble slightly. Wilhelmina watched this, and thought that her mother had spent 28 years worrying about her eldest daughter's sharp edges and inability to be soft when softness was required. And it was perhaps satisfying for both of them that Elijah Haskins was a man who did not require anyone to be other than what they were. Louisa stayed for a month, and within the first week she and Elijah had established a relationship of mutual respect based primarily on the discovery that they had both read the same 3 obscure historical texts and had opinions about all of them. Wilhelmina watched her mother and her husband argue about the causes of the Mexican-American War over dinner on the 3rd night, and felt something so complete and warm that she had to look down at her plate for a moment to compose herself. In the evenings, when Elijah was still out with the hands, Louisa would sit with Wilhelmina in the kitchen and talk in the way they had rarely talked when Wilhelmina was managing the household, and there had been no room for anything not practical. "He looks at you the way your father used to look at me," Louisa said one evening, very quietly, before the money troubles started and before everything became so heavy. "I did not know if I would ever see someone look at you that way. I was afraid your particular quality would make men back away." "Several did," Wilhelmina said. "Their loss was substantial," Louisa said, with a firmness that made Wilhelmina laugh and take her mother's hand. By summer of 1879, the The ranch had expanded its cattle operation based on a plan Wilhelmina had drafted over the winter, adding a contract with a Denver beef buyer that significantly improved the annual margin. And Elijah had hired a third hand, a serious young man named Alvarez, whose family had worked this land under a different name before the American acquisition, and who knew cattle and horses with a knowledge that went back several generations. Wilhelmina made sure he was paid at the same rate as Dawes and Pettiford, which Elijah had intended regardless, but which Alvarez noticed and appreciated. There were injustices in this land and this era that no single ranch could correct, and Wilhelmina knew this and carried the knowledge with the particular weight of someone who cannot fix what they can see, but she could be fair within the sphere she had, and she was, consistently and without fanfare. The summer also brought a letter from Clara. It came from Chicago, where apparently Horace Pemberton's piano business had relocated, and it was written in Clara's distinctive flowing hand, and it was 12 pages long, which suggested either a great deal of news or a great deal of guilt, and in practice it was both. Horace was doing well in Chicago, Clara wrote. She was happy, or something close enough to it that she was calling it happiness. She had heard through their mother that Wilhelmina had married the rancher. She hoped Wilhelmina was not angry with her. Wilhelmina read the letter twice, on the porch in the late afternoon, with the grassland moving in the summer wind in front of her, and the sound of cattle distant and peaceful, and the smell of the evening's cooking starting from inside the house. She was not angry. She had not been angry for some time, which had surprised her, because she was generally a person who felt things in proportion to their causes, and the cause was objectively significant. But somewhere in the process of traveling to Colorado and arriving at the wrong time and finding the right man in his own doorway, the anger had resolved itself into something that felt like gratitude, which was a transformation she had not been expecting and would never have predicted. She wrote back to Clara. The letter was 3 pages, clear and direct and honest, and it said, among other things, that she was not angry, that she was genuinely happy in a way that would have been impossible without Clara's particular brand of reckless instinct for self-determination, and that she hoped Chicago was kind to them both. She said that Elijah was the best person she had ever known, which was simply true, and she said that the ranch was extraordinary and the land was extraordinary, and if Clara ever found herself in Colorado, she was welcome to visit, though the accommodations were practical rather than grand. She signed it with love because she meant it, and posted it the next time Pettiford went to town. In late September of 1879, exactly 1 year after their wedding, Wilhelmina told Elijah she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, over coffee, because significant things in their life happened in the kitchen, which was the beating heart of the house and the place where they were most consistently themselves. He was silent for a moment, and then he got up and came around the table and put his arms around her from behind, where she was sitting, and rested his face against her hair, and she felt him breathe in and out once slowly, and the quality of the silence was the most articulate thing she had ever heard. "Elijah," she said. "I am here," he said. "I am just," he paused. "Happy," she said. "I do not have a word for the exact thing," he said honestly, "but yes, profoundly." She turned in the chair to look at him, and he was looking at her with an expression that was unguarded in the way it had been on the wedding morning, and the evening he told her he was in love with her, the particular expression of a man who was not managing his feelings but simply experiencing them. And she thought about 4 years of solitude, and the letter he had read more than twice, and the table that had been set for 2. "Good," she said, and took his face in her hands and kissed him the way she had learned to over the year, which was to say, with complete intention and no performance whatsoever. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was gentler than the year before, or perhaps the cold seemed less absolute because the house had changed in character, become warmer in ways not measured by a stove. Louisa had returned to St. Louis but wrote frequently, and the letters were bright and full of plans for the spring visit, which she was already treating as fixed, and Elijah had written to her himself, a brief and characteristic letter that had made Louisa cry, according to her next reply, for reasons she declined to specify but which Wilhelmina suspected involved the particular phrase. "Your daughter has made this ranch a home, which it was not before she arrived, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure she knows that." The baby was born in the first week of May 1880, in the bedroom at the back of the house where Wilhelmina had spent her first sleepless night in Colorado, with Mrs. Connolly in attendance and Elijah waiting in the kitchen, with a controlled patience that Dawes later reported had manifested as approximately 14 cups of coffee, and the complete reorganization of the tack room. The baby was a boy, sturdy and loud and indignant about his arrival, with dark eyes that Wilhelmina suspected would be his father's exact shade once they settled, and they named him Thomas Elijah Haskins, Thomas for the brother who had died of fever at 21 and whose name still lived quietly in this house, and Elijah for the man who had built the house worth coming home to. Elijah held his son for the first time with the careful, deliberate manner he brought to everything that mattered, cradled against his chest, and looked at Wilhelmina where she lay in the bed exhausted and satisfied, and said, "He is extraordinary. He is very loud," she said. "He gets that from his mother," Elijah said, with a complete straight face. Wilhelmina threw a pillow at him, and little Thomas Haskins registered his opinion of the commotion in the full voice he had apparently inherited from at least one of his parents. Mrs. Connolly, from the doorway, laughed until she had to hold the door frame. The summer of 1880 was the best summer Wilhelmina had known. Thomas thrived with the robustness of a baby born to a solid house, and two people who were paying full attention, and the ranch thrived with the expansion of the Denver beef contract, and a second smaller contract Wilhelmina negotiated with a buyer in Colorado Springs, and the pastures were good that year, and the cattle were fat, and Elijah came in from the range in the evenings with the satisfied quiet of a man whose work was going well. And Wilhelmina would hand him Thomas and watch him hold his son in the golden late afternoon light that came through the kitchen window, and think about the letter she had written to a stranger, and the stagecoach that had arrived a day early, and the door that had opened before she knocked. She thought about it often, the contingency of it, the way the entire architecture of this life had been assembled from a series of accidents and honest letters, and a widower in St. Louis who had probably not known what he was starting when he hired Horace Pemberton to tune the parlor piano. She mentioned this to Elijah one evening, sitting on the porch in the late summer heat, Thomas asleep inside. "Does it trouble you?" he asked. "The contingency of it?" She considered the question seriously, because he always meant his questions seriously. "No," she said, "it might have once. I used to find contingency frightening, the sense that things could go entirely differently based on very small factors. But I have come to think that what mattered was not the accident of the timing. What mattered was what we each already were. The accident could not have made this if we had not been the specific people we were." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When you wrote that letter to a man you had never met and told him the plain truth about a painful and awkward situation, you were exactly who you had always been. And when I wrote back the way I did, I was the same. The stagecoach arriving early did not make any of that." "No," she said, "it did not." They sat in the evening silence, and below them the grassland moved in its slow, perpetual way, and the mountains were purple against the first stars. And somewhere in the house, Thomas, Elijah Haskins, slept with the absolute certainty of a child who knew exactly where he was and who was watching over him. The years that followed built themselves the way good things build, steadily and without drama, each one adding to what was there rather than disrupting it. The ranch grew as Colorado Territory grew, the population of Cutter's Creek doubling in size by 1882 as the railroad finally came through. Not on Bellamy's terms, but on terms negotiated by a consortium of landholders that included the Haskins ranch. And the new accessibility brought new commerce, and a school for Thomas to attend when he reached the age for it, and a doctor who set up a proper practice, and the particular energy of a place becoming more fully itself. Pettiford married a quiet, determined young woman from the next county in 1881, and Elijah gave him 2 months extra pay, and Wilhelmina gave them a set of kitchen goods she had been assembling for exactly this purpose, because she had seen it coming for 6 months and had been quietly preparing. Dawes, who was a man of settled bachelor habits, accepted the change in the bunkhouse dynamics with philosophical equanimity. Alvarez was promoted to foreman in the same year, a title Elijah created specifically because the operation had grown to a size that needed formal structure, and Alvarez took the responsibility with a gravity that confirmed everything Wilhelmina had thought when they first hired him. He was paid accordingly, and the pay was fair, and this was noted in the community with an attention that said something about what most people were accustomed to. And Wilhelmina and Elijah discussed this privately and continued doing what they had always done. Louisa Alden came for her second extended visit in the spring of 1882 and fell so completely in love with her grandson and the Colorado spring that she wrote to Wilhelmina from St. Louis afterwards saying she was considering the matter of whether the boarding house could be sold, as there was a widow of her acquaintance who had been expressing interest for 2 years. Wilhelmina wrote back saying that the guest room would always be ready, and that Thomas asked about his grandmother every 3 days. The guest room became, in the autumn of 1882, a semi-permanent residence, as Louisa Alden arrived with her best furniture and an expression that suggested the decision was already made, and she would appreciate no argument, and moved into the back room of the Haskins ranch as a woman who had finally, at the age of 54, found exactly the size of life that suited her. Elijah built an addition to the house that winter, a second wing with proper rooms and a larger kitchen, planning and building it with Dawes and Alvarez and Pettiford and his young wife, who turned out to have strong opinions about wall placement that everyone agreed were correct. The work took until early spring, and the result was a house that had grown to match the life it was housing, larger but not ostentatious, solid and warm and full of books. Wilhelmina walked through the new rooms when they were finished and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been good at managing spaces her whole life and was now managing a space that was entirely, fundamentally hers. Their second child arrived in the autumn of 1883, a girl this time, which Thomas greeted with the mixed feelings of a 3-year-old whose position as the household's primary marvel was suddenly in question, and which Elijah greeted with a tenderness that took Wilhelmina's breath away, the particular way he held this small dark-haired girl as though she were both tremendously precious and not the least bit fragile. They named her Louisa me for Wilhelmina's own middle name, which she had never been fond of, but which seemed better now on this small person, who was already demonstrating opinions at 8 days old. Louisa Alden, who the baby was also named for, received the news by letter and arrived by stagecoach within the month, and Thomas greeted his grandmother with the relief of a child who understood that his position as her primary favorite was likely secure regardless of new arrivals. The naming of the baby was itself a small revolution in Wilhelmina's understanding of herself, because she had not expected to feel the depth of attachment she felt in the first moment of holding her daughter, or the way it opened something further in her chest that she had thought was already fully open. She mentioned this to Elijah one evening, the way she mentioned most important things, sitting in the kitchen after the children were in bed. "I always thought love was a finite resource," she said, "that there was a certain amount of it and it had to be allocated carefully. And then Thomas was born and I discovered that was completely wrong. It was not finite at all. It simply grew. And then Louisa was born and it grew again, and I find I keep being wrong about the limits of things." Elijah looked at her across the table with the steady dark eyes that she had been looking into for 5 years and said, "You were very carefully trained to believe that everything worthwhile was scarce and had to be rationed. Your entire youth was spent managing a household operating under scarcity. It makes sense that you would apply that understanding to things that are not subject to it." She thought about that for a moment. "When did you become a philosopher?" she said. "I have always been a philosopher," he said. "I have 1,200 acres and a lot of time to think between cattle calls." She laughed, and he smiled at her across the table in the lamplight, and Thomas's small boots were on the floor by the door, and Louisa Mee was sleeping in the cradle in the corner of the kitchen, because she was not yet moved to the nursery, and Louisa Alden was reading in the next room, and outside the Colorado mountains were dark against a sky full of stars, and the grassland was steady and patient and eternal. And Wilhelmina Alden Haskins thought that this was what she had not known to want when she was managing her father's debts and smoothing the way for a sister who would leave without warning. And yet here it was, fully real and fully hers. She reached across the table in the familiar gesture, and Elijah's hand turned under hers and held it, the same as the first time, and the same as every time since. And the lamplight was steady, and the house was warm, and outside the world was very large and very patient, and they had, between them, made something inside it that would last. 3 years after that evening, in the autumn of 1886, the Haskins Ranch was the largest operating cattle concern in that part of Colorado Territory, running 1,400 acres now after Elijah had purchased the Guthrie parcel, when old Guthrie finally decided to sell to a buyer he trusted. And the operation employed 6 hands and had a reputation along the Front Range for fair dealing and exceptional management. The Denver beef contract had been renewed twice, each time on better terms, and Wilhelmina had taken on a small consulting arrangement with 2 other ranches in the area who wanted the same kind of financial organization she had built at Haskins. And she did this work because she found it interesting, and because the money was not irrelevant, and because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving a poorly structured account unrectified when she encountered one. Thomas was 6 and ferocious in his opinions and brilliant with numbers, which Elijah said was from his mother and Wilhelmina said was from the man who had built a 1,200-acre operation from nothing through careful calculation. Louisa Mee was 3 and was already in love with horses in a way that transcended normal childhood affection and approached something more like a professional calling, which Elijah found delightful, and which Alvarez had begun accommodating by teaching her the basics at an age when most children were still learning to walk steadily. And in the late autumn of 1886, on a morning that was the color of the first winter trying to settle in, Wilhelmina sat at the kitchen table where she had read a stranger's letter 8 years ago and added things up in her clear, honest way. Not accounts this time, just the inventory of a life. She had come here by accident. She had come on someone else's ticket, to deliver someone else's regrets, on a stagecoach that arrived a day early, to a man who had been waiting at a door he opened before she knocked. She had been the wrong woman at the wrong time, and she had found herself irrevocably in the right place with the right person, and the whole sequence of it still had the quality of something she had been handed that she had not earned, until she thought more carefully about it and realized that what she had earned was exactly the capacity to receive it. She had built herself, through years of difficult management and honest dealing and the disciplined refusal to soften what was true, into the specific person who could walk into this kitchen and belong there. And Elijah Haskins had built himself, through years of solitude and loss and the same disciplined refusal to deal in comfortable fictions, into the specific person who could hold the door open for her. The accident of the timing had not made them. It had simply given them the occasion to find each other. Elijah came into the kitchen from outside, bringing with him the cold air and the smell of horses and hay, and he looked at her at the table and said, "You have the accounting face on, but there are no papers in front of you." "I am accounting for different things today," she said. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the stove and sat across from her, and she looked at him, the face that was so thoroughly familiar to her now that she could read it the way she read her own handwriting, and said, "I am expecting again." The expression that moved across his face was the one she had been watching for 8 years, the unguarded and unhidden thing, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have a proposal." "You are not supposed to say that," she said. "I am the one with sensible proposals." "Indulge me," he said, and his eyes were warm in a way that still, after all this time, did the thing to her chest that she had stopped trying to describe accurately because language was insufficient. "All right," she said. "I propose," he said, "that we sit here for a few minutes before any of the considerable business of the day begins, and simply be here, with that news between us, and not plan anything yet." Wilhelmina thought about this proposal. It was not in the strict sense sensible. There were things to do and a ranch to run and 2 children to get up and fed and a day that would not wait. "That is a very inefficient proposal," she said. "I know," he said. "All right," she said, and left the accounting where it was, and sat with her husband in the kitchen that was the heart of the house in the morning light that was coming through the window at the angle it always came at this time of year. And outside the grassland moved in the long, slow, patient way it always had and always would, and the mountains were exactly where they had always been, and the life they had built together between that permanent grass and those permanent mountains was solid and warm and full and entirely, irrevocably real. She had arrived at the wrong time. The right rancher had been standing there looking like he had expected her. And both of those things had been precisely true, and both of them had mattered, and the rest was a story that was still going and would go as long as the land held, which was to say, for a very long time indeed. The coffee cooled between them and neither of them reached for it, and the morning light moved slowly across the kitchen floor the way it always did, and Wilhelmina Alden Haskins sat across the table from the best surprise of her life and let herself feel the full unrationed depth of what she had found here. In this place she had come to by accident and stayed in by absolute intention. Outside, Thomas called for his mother from the yard, in the clear carrying voice of a 6-year-old with something urgent to report about the state of the world, and little Louisa echoed him in her 3-year-old version of the same call, and Louisa Alden's voice came from the back room in the warm, competent way of a grandmother who had everything under control. Elijah raised his eyebrows at her across the table. She raised hers back. They got up together, the way they did everything, and went out to meet the day.